Going to start. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Going to start. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Going to start. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. And just a reminder to everybody to raise their hands if there is some issue or if they need to bring something up. We're welcome to the Stand for Justice DMV's Justice Day 2021 program. We're going to start first with the recitation of the Holy Quran by Ali Raza Ja'fari.
السلام عليكم. صلوات على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. Inshallah, today I will be reciting from Surah Al-Ma'idah, chapter 5, verse 7. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. واذكروا نعمة الله عليكم وميثاقه الذي واثقكم به إذ قلتم سمعنا وأطعنا واتقوا الله إن الله عليم بذات الصدور. يا أيها الذين آمنوا كونوا قوامين لله شهداء بالقسط ولا يجرمنكم شنآن قوم على ألا تعدلوا اعدلوا هو أقرب للتقوى واتقوا الله إن الله خبير بما تعملون. وعد الله الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات لهم مغفرة وأجر عظيم. والذين كفروا وكذبوا بآياتنا أولئك أصحاب الجحيم. أولئك أصحاب الجحيم. صدق الله العلي العظيم.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Jazakallah, and thank you, Ali Raza, for that beautiful recitation. Assalamu alaikum once again to all those who are joining us, and welcome to the Stand for Justice DMV's Justice Day 2021 program. I'm Kanis Fatima, a journalist based in Lahore, and we are excited to have you all tune in and join us as we take this step to support the cause of justice and humanity around the world. Now, just as a brief intro, Stand for Justice DMV is a coalition of Muslims based in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area who are committed to providing a platform to address the issues related to justice, guided by the teachings of the Quran and the Ahlul Bayt. Now, I think we're all too familiar with these sayings, such as Desmond Tutu's famous quote that if you are neutral in situations of injustice, then you have chosen to side with the oppressor. Or even Martin Luther King's famous quote that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We're caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. The Quran itself has commanded its followers to stand out firmly for justice. Now, just yesterday, the world was alerted to a horrific attack in the Afghan capital targeting innocent schoolgirls. The images of that carnage have shaken us all to the core, I'm sure, and it is for this very reason that we've come together to play this small part in standing against oppression and injustice, which has engulfed so much of our world today in various forms. And the limited time we have in this program today, we've tried to pack in some of the most pressing issues in the world. We've got a great panel of experts for those of you who are joining us to shed light on apartheid in Palestine, civil rights in India, xenophobia in the US, and economic sanctions. Our guest panelists will be shedding more light on the current developments with regards to each of these topics, and more importantly, to highlight our part in being able to support the cause of justice. Now, first of all, I'm going to ask Sheikh Syed Suleiman Hassan to say a few words on today's program and the significance for Stand for Justice CMV's efforts at supporting the cause of justice. Now, Sheikh Suleiman spent a decade studying at the seminaries in Qom, specializing in fiqh and history. Since his return to the US, he has served as the religious director at the Baytul Ilm Academy and is as the president of the Ahlul Bayt Islamic Seminary in Streamwood, Illinois. He also serves as the religious director at the Imam al-Asr Islamic Seminary in Alexandria, Virginia. Sheikh, go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And I would like to welcome everyone to this virtual event. This is coming towards the end of the month of Ramadan, just after the last Friday known as Jumatul Wada, also commemorated around the Muslim world and around the world as Quds Day. And it's an opportunity for us to affirm for ourselves and for others that we as Muslims are committed to representing and standing up for all causes of human justice and dignity, and that is an intrinsic part of our faith. We listened to a very beautiful recitation of some verses from Surah Al-Ma'idah, and in fact, the name Stand for Justice is inspired by two verses of the Quran. One is verse 135 of Surah An-Nisa, in which we read, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Ya ayyuhal ladhina amanu kunu qawwamina bil qist shuhada'a lillah walau ala anfusikum awil walidaini wal aqrabin. O you who believe, stand up for what is true and bear witnesses for Allah, even if it be against yourselves or your parents or your most near and dear ones, meaning against your own personal interests. And then the verse of Surah Al-Ma'idah that we heard earlier, Ya ayyuhal ladhina amanu kunu qawwamina lillah shuhada'a bil qist. O you who believe, stand up for God and bear witnesses to the truth. وَلَا يَجْرِمَنَّكُمْ شَنَآنُ قَوْمٍ عَلَىٰ أَلَّا تَعْدِلُوا. And let not hatred of a people pull you to being unjust. اعْدِلُوا هُوَ أَقْرَبُ لِلتَّقْوَى. Be fair and just, that is closer to piety. وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهِ. And be conscious of your duty to Allah. إِنَّ اللَّهَ خَبِيرٌ بِمَا تَعْمَلُونَ. Verily Allah knows what you do. Now, in these two verses, we have two concepts. قَوَّامِينَ بِالْقِسْطِ and shuhada lillah, mentioned in Surah An-Nisa, standing up for the truth and bearing witness for God. And then that is reversed in Surah Al-Ma'idah, where in Surah An-Nisa we had qawwamina bil qist, in Surah Al-Ma'idah we have qawwamina lillah, stand up for justice, stand up for God. In Surah An-Nisa we had shuhada lillah, bear witnesses or bear witness for God, and in Surah Al-Ma'idah we have shuhada bil qist, bear witness for the truth. And just very briefly, what we can see is that in that juxtaposition, we find that the two are the same. Standing up for the truth and justice is to bear witness for Allah. And so either way you express it, it is the same reality. And that's because we believe that our Islamic religion is a comprehensive religion. It's not just a matter of my personal tranquility or my personal salvation, but rather, pardon me, it is to connect to God's purpose for me and for humanity and for creation. It is an act of worship and service and humility, and therefore everything that I want for my family, for my community, for humanity, and everything that I should want and pray for and strive for, all of that is just as much a part of my religion as my prayer and my fasting. Now, we're in the month of Ramadan, and many of us, we are aware that fasting is meant to give us a reminder of the fact that even food and drink that many of us take for granted are blessings of God, and we should not take them for granted. And therefore, we should have a greater concern and sympathy for the poor and the needy in society. But what's interesting is that in our Islamic teaching, there isn't a direct connection made between feeling hunger and thirst as we fast and a sympathy with those who may have food insecurity or may be suffering from poverty. In the famous sermon of Prophet Muhammad, may Allah's peace and blessings be with him, just before the month of Ramadan began, he said that in the days of the month of Ramadan, you're going to feel hunger and thirst. وَاذْكُرُوا بِجُوعِكُمْ وَعَطَشِكُمْ فِيهِ. When you feel that hunger and thirst, remember something. But he doesn't say remember the needy. The Prophet ﷺ says, وَاذْكُرُوا بِجُوعِكُمْ وَعَطَشِكُمْ فِيهِ جُوعَ يَوْمِ الْقِيَامَةِ وَعَطَشَهُ. Remember your own hunger and thirst on the Day of Judgment. Meaning use that feeling that you have of fatigue, of hunger. Maybe if you're blessed by Allah and you have the ability to get a snack or get a meal whenever you may want without thinking twice about it, then remember that in our essence, we are also needy of God's mercy. And these blessings that we have, they come from God. We have not earned them and we don't have any intrinsic right to them. And we are not better than those people who may not have some of those blessings in this world. Remember my own vulnerability on the Day of Judgment. And then the Prophet continues and he says, وَتَصَدَّقُوا عَلَى فُقَرَائِكُمْ وَمَسَاكِينِكُمْ. And then show generosity to those who are poor and those who are needy. Notice the beautiful additional step that Prophet Muhammad ﷺ has placed in this sermon. He could have said, when you are hungry and thirsty, remember the hunger and thirst of others. But Prophet Muhammad wants that remembrance and that act of charity to be something that comes with humility. And so he first says, when you feel fatigue or hunger or thirst in the Day of Judgment, remember your own vulnerability and dependence on God. Remember your own humanity. And then through that humility, give sadaqah and show concern to others. And that is the beauty of our Islamic mission, our Islamic message in all of its aspects. Our advocating for justice, our advocating for the rights and the dignity of others, is based not just on trying to change the world, not on the demonization of those who may do injustice or the dehumanization of others, but rather on humility. And the change, it begins from within, and recognizing that we also are human beings with our shortcomings, and we need to purify and better ourselves if we want to be true advocates and allies for just causes in our society or globally. And that's why there is no better time than the month of Ramadan for us to remember some of those causes that deserve our prayers and our attention. The last thing that I want to say is that we as Muslims have a very important task, and we have not always been up to that task, which is to remind society that at heart, all of the problems that exist within humanity are spiritual problems. It's not a matter of income inequality or degradation of the environment or any other superficial problem that we might see. The solution are not just policy solutions or political solutions, but they are spiritual problems, and the solutions to those problems, before they translate themselves onto the political realm or even the societal realm, they have to begin from a place of spirituality and humility. Now, everyone in the world might not agree with our Muslim theology and practices, and that's fine. But just the reminder that our human society is not a matter of an economy. It's not just a matter of politics. It's also a living spiritual being. And through our presence, with our values, and our advocacy and our advocating for justice through our values, we can make sure that the best policies, the best outcomes are present in society. So let us come in the month of Ramadan, when we come together with our communities. We come together for prayer, for breaking the evening meal, and we ask for God's mercy and His favor and His forgiveness. And let us commit that we will be more aware of the suffering and the injustices that our fellow Muslims and our fellow human beings are facing throughout the world. Not just so that we can participate in a rally or advocate for a particular candidate or a policy solution, but so that we can fully commit ourselves to human dignity and justice, even if it might be against my own personal material interests or the interests of my family and my nearest and dearest ones, as the Quran says. And when we make that commitment, then we'll find so many avenues, online and in person, to make our voice heard and, inshallah, be effective agents, advocates, and witnesses for positive change. I would like to thank all of our panelists and our guests and our participants who are here with us, and I pray that we have an enlightening and a beneficial session. Assalamu alaikum.
Jazakallah, and thank you so much, Sheikh. Thank you really for putting the concept of justice into the concept of justice into context for all of us, particularly from that Islamic perspective. And I feel that as someone who was just listening to you, we're all more eager to hear what the guest panelists have to say. I think this Ramadan, for a lot of us, it has been about Palestine, and the Sheikh mentioned the Quds Day, but otherwise as well, it's been front and center. Heartbreaking video clips and images have been emerging from Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem and have been a major cause for concern about the condition and the treatment of Palestinians. And just this Friday, the attack on Palestinian worshippers at the al-Aqsa Mosque by Israeli forces reminded us all of how the situation there continues to escalate. But Palestinians remain resilient. Now, our next speaker is Salma Rizvi. She is the president of the American Muslim Bar Association, a conglomerate of US attorneys who are inspired by the Ahlul Bayt and fearlessly work to challenge and reform the US legal system. Along with her long list of accomplishments, in 2014, Ms. Rizvi was a Center for Human Rights and Global Justice Fellow for the organization Al-Haq, the longest running human rights organization in Palestine. She lived through Israel's offensive attacks, Operation Protective Edge, and Operation Brother's Keeper. During her time there, she published numerous pieces on Palestinian human rights, presented to the International Criminal Court and the United Nations. Ms. Rizvi, go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Thank you so much for having me here today. Thank you for the kind invitation, Sheikh Sayyid Suleiman and Ambreen Baji. I hope I can share a few words to put into context what is happening right now in Palestine, particularly in these special blessed nights of Ramadan. I was blessed to work in Palestine and do human rights works on the ground in the West Bank, particularly around Ramallah and Jerusalem in 2014. And it was so beautiful to see just the spirit and the hospitality of the Palestinian people and their commitment to nonviolence. And as Sayyid Suleiman said, you know, we have to stand we have to stand for justice, even if it is against ourselves. And as an American law student, you know, many people urged me not to do human rights work in Palestine. And when I returned, they urged me not to put that work or my publications on my resume for further continuing jobs or for my professional career, because as all of you know, the Israeli lobby in America is quite strong, and our legal institutions are filled with Zionist projects across America. So it is very, very difficult to do this type of work, to do human rights work as a US American citizen on the behalf of Palestinians. But it is truly the story of Imam Hussein and the fearlessness that we've been taught in our centers growing up, the narratives of Karbala that really have inspired many people, many lovers of the Ahlul Bayt, to go to Palestine and do work there and to help the situation. Unfortunately, as you all know, the situation is grim, and in the last 7 years since I've been able to work there, I've returned for some human rights conferences, but when I was there, things have just gotten worse with the change of various US presidencies. What was so beautiful, though, was that despite living through apartheid in Palestine, particularly as a brown girl who may have passed for a darker skinned Palestinian who spoke Arabic, I understood and I witnessed and I lived through the apartheid regime and various systems of government in Israel and Palestine. But what was so beautiful is, despite all of the oppression, there was one piece of land owned by the Palestinians, or one piece of land that was protected for Muslims, and that was al-Aqsa Masjid, subhanAllah. You walk into al-Aqsa and it is this place of deep serenity and peace. It is undeniably a holy site in Islam for this reason. Your heart is just drawn to this magnificence and this power and everything that the Palestinian people have been enduring. It is because they are given this chunk. They are given al-Aqsa, a beautiful place and a home that is theirs, that has always been theirs under international law, to perform their religious rites as a holy site in Islam. And unfortunately, as we've seen this Ramadan, most brutally, that special place has been taken away and is been essentially becoming a war zone, which is something quite new and unprecedented. You know, everyone says that the violence in Israel and Palestine is the same as it's been, but no, it's getting worse. And the fact that those types of videos are coming out of al-Aqsa during the month of Ramadan is quite shocking, and it's just determinative of a movement by settler colonials who are trying to seize al-Aqsa, because al-Aqsa is also known as Temple Mount, a holy site for Jews. And so there are many Zionists who are advocating for a seizure of al-Aqsa, a tearing down of our holy site in order to erect their own, in order to excavate more of Temple Mount that is underneath al-Aqsa. So this is very dangerous. We're in a very dangerous situation right now, not just for Palestinians, but for all Muslims around the world who go and do pilgrimage at al-Aqsa. And that kind of leads to my talk today, which is about apartheid. I know I was asked to speak about apartheid in Palestine, but it's really apartheid in Israel. You know, what we see is that there's this land that is being occupied. There is what people call Israel proper, but activists call it 1948, that it's still that it was Palestinian land, will always be Palestinian land. That is sort of the map of Israel. Then you have to the east of it, you have the West Bank, and then to the west of it, you have Gaza. And so this whole area, Israel and Palestine, you know, the two-state project has basically, you know, crumbled apart because there's settlers, Israeli Jewish settlers throughout the West Bank, making these porous situations in the map that don't really allow for two states to exist. It's actually almost all of Israel. So when we talk about apartheid, we're basically talking about the entire Israeli-Palestinian land essentially being looking at it as if it was one state in a situation of apartheid, because Israel essentially has de facto control of its own land, and it has de facto control of the lands that it occupies, particularly the West Bank and Gaza. So the crime of apartheid has been defined under international law. People use it loosely, but it's actually a technical term. There's the Rome Statute, which, you know, people ask, well, what's the point of international law? Does it even do anything? But actually there's a court, it's called the International Criminal Court, the ICC, that is responsible for enacting and trying and prosecuting crimes against humanity. And so the Rome Statute, which dictates the laws of the ICC, has defined what apartheid is as a crime of humanity. Apartheid is specifically crimes against humanity committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over another racial group or groups, committed with the intention of maintaining that regime. So apartheid essentially, you know, to break it down, is a system of oppression. It is essentially racial segregation. When you think of apartheid, what comes to mind is South Africa and different roads for whites and for blacks. And the same is the situation in the West Bank. If you go to the West Bank, inshallah, and you have time to make pilgrimage to some of the holy sites in the West Bank, you will see different roads for Palestinians and different roads for Israeli settlers on Palestinian land. You will see, you will see different checkpoints for Palestinians and different free access between lands for Israelis. I mean, apartheid is clear as day when you visit the land and you see it, despite it being a contested issue with some Western legalists or theologists. Israel is an apartheid state. And in 2017, the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia published a report saying that Israel has established an apartheid regime that dominates the Palestinian people as a whole. In part, the report cited the explicit non-citizenship of Palestinians living under military occupation in the West Bank and Gaza, and the denying of Palestinian refugees a right to return to Israel. So this is a very contested issue. Even some Palestinians say, hey, if we're going to be living under occupation and you have de facto control, why don't we just become Israeli citizens? Just give us citizenship so that we can enjoy the rights that your other Israeli Jewish citizens enjoy. And, you know, obviously Israel has an incentive not to do so, because particularly when it comes to demographic and population politics, if Palestinians were to receive citizenship, Palestinian families are growing at numbers and higher rates than Israeli families. And so if there was true democracy and true citizenship, then there would, at some point, Israel would become, you know, both a Palestinian and a Jewish state, and they want to maintain it as a pure Jewish state. And so they have an incentive for creating this apartheid regime so that any Arabs that are Israeli or Arabs that have Israeli citizenship are deemed essentially as second-class citizens and can only make it so far within their democracy or within their power systems. And this was, you know, a UN report that's saying so, but also Israeli human rights reports. I think it's important for us not to you know, just to demonize all Israelis, because there are Israelis within Israel working on the ground to raise human rights issues and to create reports and to try to fight on behalf of the Palestinian people while being within Israel. Just as we are all American citizens here and we know of the atrocities that our own government perpetrates, but some of us within America are working for human rights while being an American citizens. The same is happening in Israel. And there's a great Israeli human rights organization called B'Tselem that also released a report just earlier this year, which shows a trend of more people and more, you know, somewhat moderate or traditionally right-wing or human rights organizations kind of understanding now that apartheid is real. So B'Tselem released a report denouncing Israeli apartheid and describing Israel as a regime of Jewish supremacy from the Jordanian River to the Mediterranean Sea, also referring to apartheid within Israel's own borders, not just the post-1967 occupied territories. B'Tselem pointed out to how Israeli Arabs, local councils, and communities, despite representing 17% of the country's citizenry, have access to less than 3% of the country's total area. And so this is, again, a key point that, you know, 17% of Arab Israelis that enjoy Israeli citizenship don't have access to the country's total land or area as they should be, or should, as the land was essentially Palestinian land before Israel occupied the region. And then just a few weeks ago, in the end of April, a good friend of mine is the director of the Israel-Palestinian Department of Human Rights Watch, which is a global human rights organization. They have thousands of employees across the world. And they published an over 200-page strong report just about this issue of apartheid. And they cited to statistics and works on the ground and human rights data about how Israel has exclusive control over 60% of West Bank, its borders, its airspace, and imposes restriction on the movement and the residency. And the nearly 500,000 Jewish settlers living in the West Bank have full Israeli citizenship, while the territory's 2.5 million Palestinians live under military rule. So imagine walking into a state, and this is Palestinian land. I mean, this is land that your ancestors have owned for generations, and you've stayed on the land for generations. And all of a sudden, over the last few decades, Jewish settlers, largely from America, most of them are American Zionists who are going to settle in the West Bank. They're not necessarily Israelis, because Israelis who have been there for a long time or whose families have been there for a long time actually really understand the sensitivities associated with what's happening on the ground. So it's really, you know, Americans who are engaged in the settler colonial project, and they're having rights and access to citizenship and all of the benefits that come with the current day modern infrastructure of citizenship in a way that Palestinians do not. And so the statistics are about apartheid, and both Israeli organizations, United Nations organizations, Palestinian human rights organizations, and international institutions have all now agreed that Israel is an apartheid regime. And essentially, Human Rights Watch argued in its latest report that Israel has demonstrated an intent to maintain the domination of Jewish Israelis over Palestinians in Israel, and systematic oppression and inhumane acts. So these three kind of principles, I would say, are the main principles that define an apartheid state, which is the intent to dominate, systematic oppression, and inhumane acts. All three of those are happening. Those elements are there. The crime of apartheid and inhumanity is very apparent in Israel. And so now we kind of come to this present moment of what everybody's seeing in the news, Sheikh Jarrah, and what is happening in Sheikh Jarrah. And I was going to play a video, but, you know, I'm sure you all have seen the videos of poor, you know, this Palestinian woman. Maybe I can just share my screen real quickly.
Jacob, you know this is not your house.
Yes, but if I go, you don't go back. So what's the problem? Why are you yelling at me? I didn't do this. I didn't do this.
But
it's easy to yell at me, but I didn't do this.
You are stealing my house.
And if I don't steal it, someone else is going to steal it.
No one is allowed to steal it, ya ammi.
So I hope you all were able to see that video. That's just a short clip of what's happening, which is, you know, some people have labeled it insanity. And you can kind of tell that Jewish settler colonial is an American, has an American accent, and is stealing the home of a Palestinian woman.
Nazmi was born in this house in Jaffa. So was his father.
This is just, you know, this kind of goes to show that the settler colonial project goes hand in hand with the apartheid regime. You can't separate the two. In order for Israel to continue its apartheid project, there are settlers that are willing to come into Palestinian land, steal Palestinian homes, and kind of have this discriminatory system of living. And so in Sheikh Jarrah, there are about 28 homes right now, around 500 Palestinians that are facing eviction. These homes were actually part of a deal with UNRWA, the United Nations Refugee Committee, and Jordan. These homes were commissioned post-1948 in an episode called the Nakba, the mass exodus of Palestinians. After Palestinians were ordered to exit their homes on Israeli, what is called Israel proper land now, or 1948, they were then displaced to East Jerusalem into these homes, which were essentially kind of, you know, refugee homes at that time. There's a debate now if Jordan and UNRWA that created those homes for the Palestinians in 1956, if those homes were actually ever lodged in the names of the Palestinian families. And this point is where Israeli settler organizations have been appealing to Israeli courts, and specifically the Israeli Supreme Court now is the latest slew of litigation as to whether or not they have rights or access to these homes because those homes aren't in the family names. Now, Jordan says, well, they have given paperwork and the homes are in the family names, but there's, you know, UNRWA has not. And so there's this back and forth of, you know, after Israel took over 1948 and the homes in 1956, and then the halt of certain land contracts that needed to be executed post the 1967 war, which never happened. And so they've been living there for generations, Palestinians, in these homes in Sheikh Jarrah, but the settlers are trying to take those homes, making an argument that Jews lived in East Jerusalem before 1948, kind of this right to return argument, which is quite hypocritical because Palestinians have no right to return in Israel. And so that's kind of where this legal fight is happening right now. It kind of surrounds the 1970 law on legal and administrative affairs. It's quite technical, but we'll find out on Monday, inshallah. This has been tomorrow. This is before the Israeli Supreme Court. And given how much mass outrage there has been on the forced deportation of these Palestinians from their homes, there's going to be, we're going to find out tomorrow how the Israeli Supreme Court really, what they're going to do. If they're going to allow settlers to, if they're going to evict the Palestinians from their home, nearly 500 Palestinians spanning 28 families, if there's going to be this forced eviction, particularly during the last few days of Ramadan, or if they're going to, really exercise true justice and not allow these settlers to take over these Palestinian lands. And so this is a project that is going to continue the settler colonial project in Israeli apartheid. I mean, this is not something that is going to change overnight, nor can we expect a change in momentum from the Israeli judicial bodies or the Israeli Supreme Court. Now, the question is why, as American citizens, should we care? And why, as American citizens, Shias in America, should we care? And the reality is because the U.S. is instrumental, as you all know, in funding Israeli human rights abuses. We've set aside $38 billion in taxpayer money through Israel's defense budget. And you'll see in all of the videos when settler colonialists are coming and taking homes of Palestinians or enacting terrorism against Palestinians, you'll see the Israeli military standing by and not protecting Palestinians, but allowing the violence by these settlers colonials to, be perpetrated. And how part of that is the U.S. government's complacency in funding that same military to engage in these human rights abuses. And so I want to point everybody to AMBA Legal, www.ambalegal.org. We have a statement on Palestinian society and where we kind of outline quite technically what you can do as U.S. citizens to really engage your members of Congress and to create more momentum to trying to change the status quo. And alhamdulillah, we have now women of color, members of Congress who are finally speaking truth to justice on this issue in a way that we've never seen in the U.S. landscape, but much more needs to be done. We are American citizens. I'm sure most of you pay your tax dollars. And your money is directly in some ways going to fund this kind of oppression. And so we have a duty to engage that system. It's not enough just to pay your taxes and be silent. With that same duty is the obligations to stop the oppression that your funds are essentially contributing to. So I would definitely urge, Masjid members and other members of the community to really just write to your member of Congress or make a phone call or set up a meeting to talk about the injustices and how you do not feel safe or you do not feel like it is in your religious ethics or values or codes to be funding this type of oppression against Palestinians. And I was going to go through the list of demands you could make, but instead I'll just throw it in the chat and ask everybody, feel free to look at those lists of demands. You can just copy and paste them. It's a call. And it's important to note that those demands of what the American government can do or what to ask for is not coming from us as American citizens. We didn't, create those demands ourselves. They're coming from Palestinian civil society organizations that are saying, hey, this is what you can do to help us if you are living in America and you have a voice in your democratic system, in your democratic process. Because Jewish Americans and particularly Zionist Jewish Americans have been doing this kind of work for decades. It is really, some people say like, well, we don't as a community have the funds to really create a counter lobby, but it's money. You don't really need money to create the type of movement. You really just need to use your voice and the power that you're given, subhanAllah, to try to create this change. And so I'll send that in the chat. I hope those remarks were helpful. Inshallah, I could talk for hours about this subject, but thanks for having me. And I really do hope that, we work together to try to as U.S. citizens, you know, come out against apartheid and settler colonialism in Israel, and really engage the people who have power in our legal system, in our political system, to let them know, if they're not aware, to really show that we have concerned citizens here of what's happening in Palestine. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Alaikum salam. Thank you so much, Sister Salma Rizvi, for that talk. That was extremely insightful for us all. And please do share that link that you were speaking about in the chat section. And thank you once again for all the statistics about the Israeli apartheid against Palestinians, the central role of the Al-Aqsa Mosque for the Palestinian cause, and of course for giving us a quick overview of the situation currently unfolding in Sheikh Jarrah, particularly highlighting what role we can play in all this. And I think a lot of this gets lost in the way the mainstream media outlets also try to cover Palestine. But while we're still on the topic of Palestine, I'm going to ask Layla Ali to come up and recite a poem on Palestine. Layla is 10 years old. She studies in 5th grade and loves to read, write, and cook. And Layla's recently taken up tennis. Go ahead, Layla.
So what? Justice, the 7-letter word which should be the backbone of any society. Justice, if done right, can save nations from agony. Justice, if served on time, can save heart, lives, and dignity. Justice shouldn't see race, religion, or identity. But when justice isn't for everyone, justice is only for the few. When honor, life, and property is not protected. When the blood of innocent people is not respected. When mothers bury their young sons and deal with the unexpected. When worshiping during the most of sacred times at the most sacred of places is objected. When justice isn't for everyone, justice is overdue. When nobody is there to hear the outcry of Palestine. When even the Ummah is disconnected and feeling just fine. When the brother in faith is a far distant someone who is no longer mine. When the interest of your brother in faith or equal in humanity is intertwined. When your vision is taken over by the petrodollar, which outshine. When justice isn't for everyone, when justice doesn't come through, let's not forget the order of the divine. Your term can't be postponed. That day all your sins will be counted and you will be enthroned. The Savior sent by the Almighty will remind you of all your accounts. Beware if that day your influence will not get you any discounts. When justice isn't for everyone, then your Lord sends the leader who is true. إِنَّ الَّذِينَ يَكْفُرُونَ بِآيَاتِ اللَّهِ وَيَقْتُلُونَ النَّبِيِّينَ بِغَيْرِ حَقٍّ وَيَقْتُلُونَ الَّذِينَ يَأْمُرُونَ بِالْقِسْطِ مِنَ النَّاسِ فَبَشِّرْهُم بِعَذَابٍ أَلِيمٍ. Surely as for those who disbelieve in the communications of Allah, and slay the prophets unjustly, and slay those among men who enjoin injustice, announce them to a painful chastisement. Chapter 3, Al-Imran, verse 21.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Thank you so much for that, Layla. That was so beautifully and powerfully delivered. We now have with us Nazine Shirazi, who's here to share her artistic contribution for the cause of justice. Nazine is a local young artist, and she has been painting and sketching since she was 9 years old. She's currently a general studies major at Montgomery College. Nazine, go ahead.
And then unmute yourself. Actually, exit out this.
I am unmuted. Hello. Assalamu alaikum. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Nazine Shirazi. Thank you for inviting me to this program. Today, I will be presenting my recent painting. I named it Hope for Palestine. This painting depicts the injustices happening in Palestine today. I painted a young child playing with her doll on the rooftop of her house. In the background, you can see the rubbles that are the reality in Palestine right now. Her brother stands next to her holding the flag. The flying birds from the flag portray my hopes and freedom and the good times for Palestine in the near future.
Are you done, Nazine?
Yes.
All right. Thank you so much, Nazine, for sharing that powerful image with us that you've drawn up. Sometimes words don't do justice, but images can. But moving on now, it's important to remember that as we discuss oppression and violence against people around the world, not just Palestine, and all forms of violence are not physical. A silent yet equally dangerous form of violence that has been used against civilian populations in different parts of the world is the use of economic sanctions. And while the human cost of economic sanctions doesn't always make headlines or produce flashy images, it is nonetheless essential that it is opposed just as much as other forms of injustices and oppression are. To discuss the impact of economic sanctions on civilians, we now have with us Rahat Hussein. For the past 10 years, Rahat Hussein has worked tirelessly to advocate on behalf of Shia Muslim issues to the White House, congressmen, senators, federal agencies, think tank, NGOs, and policy institutions. With an interest in America and Islam, Rahat is a prolific writer on contemporary and international issues, having also worked as a columnist with the Washington Times and with CDN News. Go ahead, Rahat.
I think you're muted, Rahat.
Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, everyone, and the organizers of the session today for inviting me to speak. I think this is a very important topic, and all the topics today are critical to our community and to the worldwide community, and those who are interested in justice. In May of 1996, there was a television show, 60 Minutes. It's still going on, but maybe some people might not be familiar with it. In May 1996, the interviewer asked Madeleine Albright, who was at the time the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, we have heard that 500,000 children have died in Iraq. That is more children than died in Hiroshima in the nuclear attack in World War II. Madeleine Albright, is the price worth it? And Madeleine Albright looked directly into the camera and said, it is worth it. She didn't say this, but she was saying it's worth it for 500,000 children to die for the U.S.'s political goals to be accomplished in Iraq. Now, you might think that this was a major controversy, and in the Muslim community, it was a major controversy. But outside the Muslim community, it was not. And just a few months later, she was appointed by then President Bill Clinton to be her Secretary of State. And during Senate confirmation hearings, she repeated that sanctions against Iraq must continue and cannot be abated. And not a single Republican or Democrat senator asked her about this statement she made about 500,000 children dying and it being worth it. So in essence, she suffered no political consequences from that. Sanctions are a tool used by different countries to impose their will upon other countries or other individuals. The most famous sanctions are from the US, but I'll talk about that in a minute. But there are other sanctions by Russia, by the European Union, and others. And the goal of a sanction is to use the economic might of the sanctioning country to force political, security, or policy changes in the target. So in the case of the US, we actually have only 6 or 7 countrywide sanctions against entire countries: Iran, North Korea, Syria, Cuba, and Venezuela, as well as Turkey. And while those entire countries are sanctioned at a government level, we have more than 1,500 sanctions against individuals, companies, organizations that carry the same weight of power of the United States to prohibit financial transactions with those countries and those people. So a lot of people don't understand how is the U.S. able to impose sanctions when other countries can't? What's the basis of the United States power? 60% of the world's monetary reserves are held in the US dollar. Some of you may recognize that if you go to another country, you can use US dollars. That's even true in Mexico, in the Caribbean, in Iraq, in Europe, in some places. And the reason for that is that many countries have adopted the US dollar as their form of international trade. So this gives the US an immense amount of power to control the finances of other countries and to track the finances of other countries. In fact, the US uses sanctions more than any other country in the whole world. And the way that sanctions can happen is that Congress can issue the sanction, or the president himself has the authority to issue sanctions through executive order. You know, America has had the power to issue sanctions since the 1800s. However, this power was not used, and it was not of any interest to the United States until after World War I, where sanctioning countries related to the Axis, and then after World War II, sanctioning Nazi governments and their allies became popular. As we all know, sanctions impact Iran, they impact other countries that are of interest to Shia Muslims. But what is it that they actually do? In 2019, the US instituted comprehensive sanctions against Iran and several other countries. And what the sanctions have the effect of doing is removing the country's ability to engage in financial transactions with different organizations, with different banks, and the like. So the example that a lot of people like to give is what would happen if no one would accept your cash, no one would accept your credit cards, and no one would accept checks from you. In essence, that is what happens to a country that is sanctioned. They have the money, they have the power, they have the authority, but because of US sanctions, they're not able to buy medicine, they're not able to buy technology, they're not able to buy infrastructure that their country needs, they're not able to pay for services. And over a year or two or three or four or five, the effect of a sanction is limited. But when you get into more than 5 years, more than 10 years, what happens is the infrastructure of the various countries starts to significantly weaken, healthcare starts to significantly weaken, and sanctions in effect become a tool that is as strong as any military in terms of the devastating effect on the country that is sanctioned. Now, are they effective? Frankly, they're not effective. The US has had sanctions against Iran since 1980s. And we see that Iran has not changed their behavior towards the United States or their attitude towards the United States in that time. But that's, in terms of sanctions, relatively recent. The United States has had sanctions against Cuba for more than 70 years without a single policy change on behalf of the Cubans towards the United States or towards the goals that the US is trying to accomplish. The Cuba sanctions, in particular, other countries don't wish to enforce. And that's the power of a sanction. If the US alone doesn't want to do business with a country, that's one thing. But what the US has done is they have gone around the world and they have told other countries that if you engage in business with Iran or North Korea or what have you, you will also be financially penalized. So they've used these scare tactics to make the sanctions more effective. In other countries, you know, because of that scare tactics, it works. In countries like Iran, Venezuela, and the like, it's extremely effective. For North Korea, Cuba, and the others, governments like China and others absolutely ignore the sanctions, completely removing their effectiveness. So I was asked to talk about the effectiveness of sanctions and whether they have a humanitarian effect on the country that is being sanctioned. And so I have a few bullet points. First, sanctions are rarely effective. In a global economy, sanctions tend to impose greater costs on the American companies and the American economy. And the target can usually find ways around the sanctions. So effectiveness is very low. So for America to be engaging in a strategy of sanctions against various Muslim countries and various Muslim groups, it's really shooting itself in its own foot. Secondary sanctions are when you say, okay, I'm not going to do business with you, but I'm also not going to let anyone else do business with you, and I'll try to punish those secondary parties if they try to do business with you. Trying to compel others by sanctioning secondary parties can have an immense harm on the U.S. economy. When it is effective, however, not only does it harm the U.S. economy, but it harms the well-being of ordinary citizens in the target countries. As I discussed before, healthcare goes down, infrastructure goes down, the economy goes down. You just increase poverty, you increase antipathy towards the United States, and you don't really accomplish your goals. Sanctions in the end are blunt instruments that really don't accomplish their goal and produce unintended and undesirable consequences. And in many countries, sanctioning has encouraged more anti-Americanism, has encouraged more humanitarian crises, and reduces the power and effect of diplomacy once the two countries do wish to engage in it. So overall, I think it's clear that sanctions are an economic tool that don't really accomplish a lot except for hurting innocent people. We see that governments who are sanctioned don't change their behavior. They don't modify their policies. And the U.S. doesn't accomplish its own goal in that way. The U.S. economy is hurt. The world economy is hurt. Overall, they are an extremely ineffective and inefficient tool that causes more problems than they solve. If anyone has any questions, you can message me in the chat, or you can send me an email. But I think for those who are familiar with sanctions, I mean, they're an immense problem. Recently, a specific Hosa in Iran was sanctioned for unclear reasons, and frankly, it didn't hurt the Iranian government, even though that was the goal of the sanction. It didn't hurt any Iranian politician. What it did end up hurting was the religious Shia Muslim community, who many times are not political. It hurt religious scholars who are mostly non-political. It hurt religious students who are not political. So what was the goal of the sanction was to hurt the Iranian government. Who did it hurt? Everyone else but the Iranian government. And of course, I'm not saying this is a legitimate goal to harm the Iranian government, but I'm just saying the goal of the sanction was completely nullified, and the sanction did not accomplish its intended effect. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that insightful talk, Brother Rahat Hussein. As someone who's lived through and witnessed the effect of economic sanctions firsthand, personally, a lot of what you've said has hit home for me. And just a quick reminder to all the participants at the Justice Day 2021 program, if you have any questions for our panelists, please leave them in the chat box or the comment section, and we will get to them at the end of the program. Next, we have Sheikh Abdul Jalil Al-Nawai, who will be speaking about the concept of justice in Islam and the religious duty of all Muslims to fight against oppression and injustice and speak up for the voices, particularly during these uncertain times that we live in today. Now, Sheikh Abdul Jalil started his seminary studies at the Ahlul Bayt Institute in Accra, Ghana, and after years of service in Ghana, the Sheikh moved to Iran for further seminary studies. Currently, he serves as a resident alim or scholar for the Idara Ja'fariya Islamic Center in Burtonsville, Maryland. Sheikh, go ahead. Is the Sheikh with us?
I think he may have had some trouble logging on. So why don't we move forward and we'll try to figure out what the issue is and troubleshoot it.
All right, so we will get back to the Sheikh in a bit, but we're going to now turn our attention to India, be it the worrying status of Kashmiris, where they find their basic and inherent rights increasingly violated by an already very militarized and oppressive environment, or be it the civil rights of Muslims and other minority groups in India who find themselves as the latest victims of the policies and rhetoric of an increasingly extremist government. We're going to now speak to Javed Zaidi to shed more light on these worrying course of events in India. Javed Zaidi is an entrepreneur, strategic advisor, and thought leader. He's also the founder and managing partner of Ali Data. He has authored 2 books on data-driven leadership and penned over 100 articles on various topics. Go ahead.
Thank you, Sister Kaniz, and thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to speak today and to share my thoughts. Just wanted to clarify that I am certainly not an academic or an expert in this field, but I did grow up in India and moved to the US about 30 plus years back. So I do have a lot of relatives there, so keep in touch. So as you mentioned, the situation in India is pretty grim from a minority standpoint. And I think, there are certainly challenges on various fronts. But, the message I want to share today is that at the end of the day, we have to, as Muslims, deal with the oppression and the tyranny in the best way possible. As Imam Hussain and Imam Ali, were examples for us to stand up to the tyranny and stand up to the oppression, stand up for our principles. And be good Muslims and basically, fight the good fight for us. So with that, I prepared a very short presentation that I would like to share here, if you don't mind. Let me see if I can pull it up. So, I wanted to start with some background on what is going on in India. You are probably familiar with the Babri Masjid situation, December 1992. The Masjid was, was sort of attacked, and that started a pretty serious round of confrontation and violence across the country, putting Muslims at risk. There's also, various laws that have been incorporated. There's one that's called Love Jihad, which is threatening interfaith marriages and primarily targeted towards Muslims. There's also, some concerns in the media as well as in the press about Muslims being in significant danger in India. Another interesting point to note is last year there was a small congregation of about 200 Muslims that were meeting in New Delhi just when the COVID situation was emerging. And they were scapegoated and blamed for the coronavirus outbreak within the country. Primarily, used as a political tool to stigmatize Muslims and kind of, label them as folks that are not very careful. And then also, there's certainly lots of activities happening where it's very clear that Muslims are being marginalized, and due to various factors. There's political factors going on. There's some religious aspects of this. There's also economic warfare happening, etc. So the situation is certainly not ideal, and we in the West can certainly play a role in addressing some of these with our government and trying to influence the situation on the ground. So let me share some facts regarding Muslims. The population, Muslims represent about 15% of India's population, close to 200 million, significant number. And in 2050, the population is going to grow about 18.4% based on the Pew Research Center. And the population of Hindus are going to be decreasing by about 3%. So again, a significant, sizable population that is certainly considered a threat in some manner to the mainstream, and also in many cases used as a punching bag by the folks who want to paint us in bad light. Another interesting statistic, even though Muslims constitute 15% of the population, we only have 5% of members of parliament. that represent us. As you can see, there's a significant problem there from a representation standpoint. And as you can see on the chart, the bottom, the bottom level, you can see that the representation was pretty low in the 4%. In the 52, kind of rose up to about 9% in the early 80s, and then it's been dropping steadily ever since. So this is not a good sign for us, because we certainly need more politicians and we need more influence at that level to make things happen. Also, another interesting statistic, right? We constitute 15% of the population, but only 3% of India Inc., which is senior leadership within corporations, private sector, etc., are represented by Muslims. Major problem for us because, again, as you know, if you don't play a big role, if you don't play a senior level role, and you don't have leadership positions in the private sector, you really cannot help yourself or your community in becoming economically healthy. In 2005, as some of you may know, there was some. Prior to 2005, there were some riots in Gujarat, and many hundreds of Muslims were impacted. Many lost their lives. So there was a Sachar committee that was created by the Prime Minister Manmohan Singh in 2005 to address the root cause of these problems and figure out how we could improve things in India. It's a pretty interesting report. I would encourage everyone to go back, and study it. It's available online. But what the report basically said or concluded is that the conditions facing Indian Muslims was below that of the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. The SCs and STs are considered the bottom level within the Indian caste system. So what this report basically said is that the Indian Muslims basically fall even below that, category, which is pretty scary when you think about it. So the bottom line is that Muslims in India significantly lag in the political, educational, and professional spheres. And we really, that is certainly a challenge, and that's certainly something that we have to be very concerned about. And we can play a role by influencing our leaders here. So again, the question I kept asking is, okay, what do we need to do, right? How do we fix this problem? And there was a very interesting article. There's an Indian author called Ghazala Wahab, who's written a book on this topic. And what she basically says is Muslims in India need to empower themselves. You really cannot look at other communities or the politicians or the leaders or anybody else. We basically have to take the ball in our hands, and we need to go do things to fix our situation, right? We need to help ourselves rather than depending on others. So that I felt is probably what is the key to fixing a lot of these problems that we see. Whether it's on the political front, whether it's on the educational front, whether it's on the professional front, we have to take that and we have to empower ourselves and to make that happen. So I want to close by a very powerful quote by Imam Ali, where he says, your sickness is from you, but you do not perceive it, and your remedy is within you, but you do not sense it. You presume you are a small entity, but within you is enfolded the entire universe. You are indeed the evident book by whose alphabet the hidden becomes manifest. Therefore, you have no need to look beyond yourself. What you seek is within you, if only you reflect. So I found this extremely, extremely beautiful and inspirational. And so the bottom line is, from a community perspective, Allah will only help us if we help ourselves. We really cannot look outside for help. We have to empower ourselves, and we have to move forward. And the 4 areas that we should be focusing on is education, get the best education possible in every field possible, become entrepreneurs, because that's one way to help the community to, you can increase employment, you can help your community financially, you can help them in various ways. Self-empowerment is extremely important. And then finally, be good Muslims so that we are role models and we present a very positive image of Islam wherever we go, whether it's on the professional front or on the personal front. And I believe if we do these things, we will inshallah succeed and be able to overcome a lot of the challenges that we have, whether it's in India or other parts of the world. So with that, I will turn it back to you, Sister Kaniz. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brother Javed Zaidi, for that comprehensive presentation and just giving us a good overview of what the statistics and the demographics are like when it comes to understanding the situation of Muslims within India. Now, moving on, I'm going to play a very powerful spoken word delivered by Saleha Akil. It's extremely powerful and very moving, so I'm just going to share my screen for you, and we can just take a listen in. Okay.
Dearest oppressor, I thought I would always be afraid. Broken spirit, broken back, a shivering, shattered mess. I thought I would suffocate under all of this weight. Your kids and empty magazines make for one heavy load. I thought my only chance at survival was to swallow my pride and surrender. To keep my hands up when you shouted, keep my hands up or you would shoot, keep my hands up. I thought this Black Muslim child's only chance in life was to become a constant apologist, giving away what was truly mine. I'm sorry for all the space I'm taking up. But yesterday, an old enemy reminded me that hands up is a position of power. Hands up is a position of power. Hands up is a position of power. So I prayed for the fortitude of Mahdi and the courage of Hussein, for the innovation of Khadija and the power of Zainab, because what is power if not what the Imam left us and what his family left us? And dearest oppressor, I am writing this letter to you because I know you would hate all of this strength I found. Use it as grounds to further your irrational fear and rationalize your decision to put a bullet through me, because anything with this much strength that isn't red like blood, white like you, or blue like that sky you claim to own doesn't deserve to breathe. But my hands are up. My hands are up. My hands are up. Don't shoot.
SubhanAllah, that was, I hope you found it just as moving and as powerful as I did. That was Sister Saleha Akil sharing her spoken word with us. Now we're going to shed some light on a topic which hits closer to home for many of us who are tuning in from the US particularly, although it is relevant for those in Europe as well at the moment. It's the rise in xenophobia that has taken an alarming turn in the past few years, something a lot of us have acutely felt and experienced. Now, the current pandemic and the vitriol attached to it perhaps has exacerbated the situation even further. So let's have a look at this presentation prepared for us by Nihal Naqvi on xenophobia in the US.
Assalamu alaikum everyone, and thank you so much for having me. And as you may know, this month is Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. So one of the things we've seen, not only this month, but in our recent domestic affairs is definitely a rise in hate towards Asian Americans. And a lot of that is embedded through our history as a country. So I will definitely be going through a documentary that was created by PBS that shares testimonials from Asian Americans and how this racism has been embedded in our country for a very long time. So I'll, inshallah, be sharing my screen. So one instance is definitely the Vietnam War. And this testimonial was made by Mike Nakayama. And he was enlisted in the Marine Corps to serve the US during the Vietnam War. And even though he was enlisted in the Marine Corps, he was singled out and called racial slurs that I can't even say on screen. And he was compared not only by using racial slurs, but they compared him to what the Vietnamese people that they were killing. And they were saying that this is someone that looks like the opponent, and should be expected that, someone like him we should be killing. And that treatment of a soldier, and of an American that they're putting out there, to accomplish their political goals, much of which we as Muslims don't even agree with, really highlights the dehumanization, of human life and Asian Americans. And that definitely shows that a lot of minorities and Asian Americans have definitely been used, not in the sense of being human, but in the sense of advancing, political goals. And that's definitely been a big part of our history, and definitely something that has its roots are showing today in the increased hate we see. So the next situation is also World War II. And a lot of Asian Americans like Susan Cuddy were ejected from officer training school just because they're Asian American. And they noticed that the sentiment of, exclusivity really translated, because when she joined the US Navy as a gunnery officer, she witnessed commanders using slurs, and they connected the race of those that they were fighting. And some of those people were even, sitting next to them with the same race. They were connecting that race and, increasing their desire to kill more and more people, because they saw the fear that, this racial tensions cause. And, this really demonstrates that racial prejudice, whether in our military institutions and our policing or any other really militarized institutions in our country, this racial prejudice has been cultivated, and it's becoming a norm, because it's very rare that people in those positions of power really speak out, and it takes such a long time, especially, for example, this commander in the Navy, to even become exposed about their actions in the past, and it to come out to all of us. So beyond the scene of war, there's also has been a lot of discrimination towards Asian Americans in the labor field, especially in 1965. There was a grape strike with Filipino Americans and the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee. And a lot of the times these strikes happen because workers feel that their labor is worth much more than what their owner of the company or business is really providing them. And the problem and the racial inequity that's seen here is because a lot of these people of color and Asian Americans, their labor and their jobs don't offer the same benefits and securities. So when they go on strike and they really try to unionize and use their collective strength, they also lose their benefits along the way, and that happens a lot with people on the lower end of the spectrum in the economy, such as minorities and Asian Americans in this case. So another feature is this famous photo of the 19th century, and it was celebrating the first U.S. Continental Railroad that was built. And if you look at the picture on the left-hand side of your screen, you can see a lot of the railroad workers that created the railroad, but it turns out that all the Chinese workers who created the railroad were blurred out or removed from the picture. And that really shows that the inherent worth of minorities, whether African Americans with slavery or Asian Americans, and this context of constructing infrastructure, it really shows that people of color were seen more as a piece of labor and a tool for profit than as human beings and as people who have an inherent worth and should be celebrated for their accomplishments and their productivity. And the last occurrence that highlighted by this documentary by PBS was the Japanese internment camps. And one of the criteria was just 1/16 of your blood had to be of Japanese descent for you to be eligible to be put in these internment camps. And these families and even pregnant women were put in inhumane facilities such as horse stables where people could still smell the manure, and these are not suitable conditions for humans, let alone pregnant women and vulnerable children. So a lot of the families believe that if they had more children, then the authorities would be more lenient, because women and children have historically have different treatment than other groups of people. And it turns out that this was false, and that their perceptions were not how the authorities treated them. And that really led to generational inequities, because all of these children born in internment camps really led to, whether that's deficiencies in nutrition or in wealth, because when their parents are in these internment camps, they're losing on a lot of generational wealth. So that's definitely, whether through more recently with internment camps or a lot of the wars that we talked about, this discrimination piles up and has a collective effect throughout history, and it definitely translates today into what we see and a lot of the inequities you see today.
Nihal, are you done with your presentation?
Yes. Sure.
Okay, thank you so much. That was very informative, particularly the point about the cultivation of racial prejudice for political gains. Extremely informative, especially the historical context. So, Jazakallah for that. I'm being told that Sheikh Abdul Jalil al-Nawai is back with us. As I mentioned, the Sheikh serves as the resident alim or scholar of the Idara Ja'fariya Islamic Center in Burtonsville, Maryland, and he is going to touch on the concept of justice in Islam. Sheikh, go ahead.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين ثم الصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدي وحبيبي ونور قلبي طب القلوب ودوائها وعافية الأبدان وشفائها ونور الأبصار وضيائها أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين الذين ذاب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. قال الله سبحانه وتعالى في محكم تنزيله بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ولا تحسبن الله غافلا عما يعمل الظالمون إنما يؤخرهم ليوم تشخص فيه الأبصار. صدق الله العلي العظيم. My dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. In these few minutes that we have, I would like to just elaborate about the concept of justice in the eyes of Quran and Hadith. But before I analyze in that sense, we need to define what is justice. in the eyes of Islam. Because what we may think is a justice in our eyes might not be the same thing what Islam views as a justice. Now, there are many things in Islam we view it differently, and the Quran and Islam view something different. I'll give you a simple example. How do we measure success? Today, if you ask, what do you think is success? An average person, they'll tell you, getting degree, making good money, right? This is our success in our eyes. But that's not what Islam views as a success. The same thing applies to when we talk about justice. What we view as a justice might not be the same what Islam views. And we as a Muslims, our view about justice or injustice has to be within the frame of teaching of Islam, as a Muslim to speak. Now, so with that said, we need to understand what is justice, what is injustice by the definition of Islam. But if this is clear, before we talk about the justice or injustice, I would like to say in Islam, to understand some concept, you have to look at the opposite of that concept that you're trying to understand. Give you an example. Today, I cannot appreciate being rich unless I've been through poverty. Then, understanding the richness becomes more appreciated because I know what the opposite is about. I cannot appreciate being healthy unless I become sick. Then the opposite becomes very important because I compare both. I know which one is which. So with that said, I would like to start with the definition of injustice to begin with. Our scholars, they gave 3 definitions of injustice. Number 1, they say al-dhulm, which is in Arabic. Al-dhulm means injustice. They say al-dhulm huwa wad'u shay fi ghayri mahall, which means putting something where it doesn't belong to. Now, in life, there are things that by nature, by common sense, things needs to be where they're supposed to be. Give you an example. In my house, there is something called bedroom. There's something called kitchen, right? Now, each one of this location has its own place that things needs to be. Now, if I put my bed into the kitchen, it's called a volume, which means putting things where they don't belong to. That is number 1. Number 2, they define injustice too, where they say Adamu i'ata'i kulla shay'in haqqahu. When you don't give things what they deserve. Because every being has the capacity and the limitation of what they deserve. Now, when I fail to do that, it's called volume. Now, this is more what our scholars are more accepting versus others. Now, if this is clear, let's come to justice. Justice also, there are different definitions. First, number 1, they say al-adlu bima'na taswiya, which means justice means equality, which we hear a lot of time. Other people raise the same voice, justice, equality. So when they define justice, they say equality. 3 individuals, 2 individuals, you treat them equal. That's called justice. But this definition is rejected by the Islam. You cannot treat everything equal. It's impossible. Yeah, some things, yes, but not everything. All right. Now, simple example, if I have 2 sons, one is 2 months old, one is 10 years old, for example. Now, does justice means to treat them equal? Which means I expect both of them to do exactly the same because they both are my sons. No, it doesn't make sense because one's age is different than the other. And the body capacity and the ability is 2 different things. So that is where our scholars don't agree with this, right? And then they come to the second one. Al-adlu wad'u ash-shay'i fi mahalli. Putting things where they belong to. Now, this is much closer. But the best definition, إعطاء كل ذي حق حقه. To give every being what they deserve of the right. That is what the definition of justice is. That Islam says, for a society to live in peace and harmony, we are required to give every individual, starting from Allah first, right, to human beings, to animals, and to the nature. Because in Islam, justice is not about you and I as a human being. No. Justice is not about you as a father or the son. No, it applies on all levels. That's what today in Islam. If I do any wrong to an animal, Yawm al-Qiyamah, I will be held accountable. Right? So justice in Islam is broader and bigger than what we think of. Right? And this justice has been the primary teaching of Islam from day one. That Islam has been teaching and also trying to draw the attention of us to always do justice. But justice starts from where? From myself. I have to be just with myself. I have to be just to my family. I have to be just within my community. I have to be just what? Other being around me. Until this, if this is not done, that is considered what? Injustice. And you go to the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala calls many times about how, in the terms of a government level, how they all have responsibility. وَمَنْ لَمْ يَحْكُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الظَّالِمُونَ. Right? Now, this injustice is what we are experiencing today. When you look the world of today, it's very, very heartbreaking. Even the simple justice that human beings deserve is not there today. And we can see what has happened. Just some simple example. What happened yesterday in Afghanistan, in Kabul, before the eyes of all human beings. We all saw it. We heard it in the news. Children coming from school, a human being, right? You would think it's a human being, will go and kill these innocent children. 48 of them, children, people were dead, killed, and 52 injured. Now, where is that justice? Now, question, what does those children do to deserve this kind of treatment? The crime they committed was what? Because they are going to the school called Ahlul Bayt or Imam Hussein school. That's their crime. And the world is watching all of these injustice. You know, one thing that I want to say, my dear brothers and sisters, because our time is limited, we as a people, as a Muslims, whatever we call ourselves, we have to understand we all have responsibilities. Day before yesterday, we saw what happened in Quds, where people are in the Masjid praying. Right? Now it's like those Zionist army, as if like they hate to see Muslims pray. You know, shooting and firing upon these people while they are in the Masjid. And the world is watching. And nobody will come and say, oh, we denounce this act. Oh, no, the Zionists are wrong. Oh, these Takfiris are doing wrong thing. They shouldn't. No, it's like, okay. That is the injustice that we are experiencing. And I'm not talking because these people are Muslims. Because injustice is injustice when it comes from anybody. Even if this happens on Hindus, we are required to speak against it. And that's why we speak against Yemen. What is happening to Yemenis by the Saudi government, that's what we are also condemning that day in and day out. Because this is the bottom line. We as a followers of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, when we read the last will of our Imam, Amir al-Mu'minin salamullah alayh, that's what he told us. Kuna lil-zalimi khasma walil-mazlumi awna. Stand by the oppressed ones And Imam Ali, when he says Madlum, didn't mention Muslim, Hindu, Jews, Christian, doesn't matter. Any injustice that is happening out there, we have responsibility to speak about it, stand against it, do something against that injustice, and support those who have no voice or not have no power to defend themselves. We are required to do that. And the reason is not just Islamic reason, also the reason is to protect ourselves. Because if any injustice is happening in Palestine, in Yemen, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Nigeria, in any part of the world, if we stay silent, then trust me, those oppressors, they are not going to stop there. They're going to want to come to another country and another country, and we might be part of that injustice. So to stop that, we have to be the voice of those who don't have voice and speak on behalf of those who cannot speak on themselves, so that we can end this injustice, so that the world can experience the justice for all, inshallah. I pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that may Allah make us to be the instrument of justice for all in this world, Ya Rabbil Alameen, and help us to work for that cause in any capacity that we can, inshallah. Walhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, wa sallallahu ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Jazakallah, Sheikh Jalil, and thank you for your insight. That was truly enlightening, and I'm sure all of us will be reflecting on what you've said for days to come. And a special jazakallah for raising the issues and instances of injustice that we haven't been able to cover in detail at this limited time. And it's important that we do keep those issues in mind, like what's happening in Nigeria, Yemen, etc. Now, as we're winding down, I'm just going to remind all the participants that if you have any questions, please do leave them in the chat or comment section so that we can get to them towards the end and the panelists can answer. We're now going to ask Sheikh Mahdi Muhammad Poor to take the mic and deliver his closing remarks. Sheikh Mahdi teaches Islamic studies at the Muslim Community College and is an instructor at the Mizan Institute. After spending 9 years studying at the seminaries in Qom, the Sheikh is currently pursuing his doctoral studies at Georgetown University. Sheikh, go ahead.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. والصلاة على رسول الله وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين. Thank you so much for extending this invitation. It's an honor to be here. I wanted to share a few thoughts, again, drawing from the teachings of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, specifically from Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salatu wassalam, and those instructions found in Nahj al-Balagha. And really it's to draw our attention to the fact that, you know, issues like these are time sensitive. Our obligation as Muslims to enjoin the good and forbid the evil is, I think, is lost on no one, and it's understood to be the cornerstone of what it means to be Muslim. And it's one that extends to all believers. It's not something that is restricted to a certain class. Rather, young and old, men and women, we are all tasked with participating and contributing to this religious act of enjoining the good and forbidding the evil, and of course, lending support to the oppressed and opposing the oppressor is a prime example of that. I want to share 3 examples from Nahj al-Balagha, where Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salatu wasalam is speaking to the Muslim community in different registers about the importance of standing up and taking action, and of not falling prey to some of the tactics that are used to lower morale and to cause confusion, doubt in the minds of the believers. First is from the 26th or 27th sermon of Nahj al-Balagha, where the Imam is speaking to soldiers that the Imam is guiding them in their fight against hypocrisy and against injustice in the Muslim community. And he speaks really of the frustrations of all that is prepared for that group, but for the Muslim community as a whole, and the unfortunate failure to act accordingly. He says, فَيَا عَجَبًا عَجَبًا, how strange, how strange. وَاللَّهُ يُمِيتُ الْقَلْبَ وَيَجْلِبُ الْهَمَّ مِنْ اجْتِمَاعِ هَؤُلَاءِ الْقَوْمَ عَلَى بَاطِلِهِمْ وَتَفَرُّقِكُمْ عَنْ حَقِّكُمْ. Says, by God, my heart sinks to see the unity of these people in their wrongdoings and your dispersion from the right. فَقُبْحًا لَكُمْ وَتَرَحًا حِينَ صِرْتُمْ غَرَضًا يُرْمَى يُغَارُ عَلَيْكُمْ وَلَا تُغِيرُونَ وَتُغْزَوْنَ وَلَا تُغْزَوْنَ وَيُعْسَى اللَّهُ وَتَرْضَوْنَ. This may woe and grief befall you. You have become the target at which arrows are shot. You are being killed and you do not kill. You are being attacked but you do not attack. Allah is being disobeyed and you remain agreeable to it. Again, it's a reflection really of asking ourselves, after acknowledging the pervasive injustice across the world, and that these injustices are not just targeted to people who are other than us, people who may be of another culture, another religion, another country, another ethnicity, but these attacks are directed at us. And for some reason, we find ourselves incapable, incompetent, distracted, defeated in our ability to band together, to strategize, and to respond accordingly. Now, what the response is for us to collectively come together and decide. And of course, we have to drive our responses by the information, the data, the wisdom that's available to us to make informed decisions and effective decisions. But the larger point is that we seem to be suffering from a disunity, that for whatever reason, those who are looking to subjugate us and the oppressed of the world, take advantage of us, they seem to be finding ways to work together, to collaborate. But for whatever reason, when it comes to the issue of truth, when it comes to the issue of standing up against injustice, we find these shortcomings. This is not only displeasing but frustrating to the Imam. The Imam is saying that these attacks are being directed right at you, but you don't have a response that is appropriate. The most recent of them is bombing, targeting a school that is working to educate children in a part of the world that, that basic right has been denied to them. And knowing that school, the Shuhada school, is working towards educating young Shia Afghanis, and then knowing again, because their attacks are targeted, that this school operates in 2 shifts, that the first shift in the morning is for the boys and the afternoon shift is for the girls, that they purposefully target their attacks in ways to expose their lack of humanity. What more is it going to take for us to see, for us to hear, for us to experience? These are our brothers, our sisters. These are our family members. These are our, members of our religion and members of our country, if that's something that we find to be honorable and something we find to be, important. We are being attacked. What is it going to take for us to work together to respond? And now, if we find ourselves turning to excuses and for reasons why we should do one thing or the other or should not act, the Imam is also, fed up with these things, because he continues, فَإِذَا أَمَرْتُكُمْ بِالسَّيْرِ إِلَيْهِمْ فِي أَيَّامِ الْحَرِّ قُلْتُمْ هَذِهِ حَمَارَةَ الْقَيْضِ أَمْهِلْنَا يُسَبَّخْ عَنَّا الْحَرِّ. Because when I asked you to move against this group in the summer, when it was hot, you said, spare us until the heat subsides from us. وَإِذَا أَمَرْتُهُمْ بِالسَّيْرِ إِلَيْهِمْ فِي الشِّتَاءِ قُلْتُمْ هَذِهِ صَبَارَةُ الْقُرِّ أَمْهِلْنَا يَنْسَلِخْ عَنَّا الْبَرْدِ. When I ordered you to march in the winter, you said, it's severely cold. Give us time until the cold clears from us. كل هذا فرارا من الحر والقر. These are all just excuses of evading the heat or the cold. فإذا كنتم من الحر والقر تفرون فأنتم الله من السيف أفر. Because if you run away from the heat and the cold, you will be, by Allah, running away in greater degree from the sword. Again, it's asking us to take seriously what are the impediments and the blockades that's stopping the Muslim community, the Shia community, the oppressed community from banding together and delivering a response that is commensurate to the injustices that are being perpetrated in the world. There's more than 1 billion Muslims living in the world. And though many of them are not in capable positions materially, collectively we have more than enough available to us to be able to provide a response that is appropriate and to secure our rights and secure the rights of others in the world that are being oppressed. So this is just one of the examples from Nahj al-Balagha. There are two more, and I'll just quickly read from them to draw our attention to it, and I'll end my my talk. It says, Ayyuhan nas, this is in Sermon 165 or 166, depending on the versions. لو لم تتخاذلوا عن نصر الحق ولم تهنوا عن توهين الباطل لم يطمع فيكم من ليس مثلكم ولم يقوى من قوي عليكم. O people, if you had not evaded support for the truth and had not felt weakness from crushing wrong, then he who does not match you will not have aimed at you. And he who overpowered you will not have overpowered you. The problem, though, is that we allow this to happen to ourselves. The Imam is saying, if you had taken your priorities seriously in life, these things would have never happened, at least in the way that they're happening today. I personally am fully convinced that that's the case. All the pressure, with all of the banding of the world's imperial powers, not just against us, but against anyone who allows them to be bullied. If we had had that sense of self-conviction, of confidence and trust in God, we would have never got to this point. And it really should be a painful sight for us to see ourselves, our brothers, our sisters, our loved ones, being, tortured and being, frankly, eviscerated from this earth because of our inactions. What I want to share is that a day like this, an event like this, is to call us to what's most central in our Muslim experiences, and that is to support the oppressed and to stand up against the oppressor. And when we look to the tradition of Ahlul Bayt alayhi salatu wasalam and what they have to say about the merits of that, we find that though things like prayer and fasting and the performance of Hajj are all important and have their place, in comparison to lending support to the oppressed, they are incomparable. All of these are to prepare us to take action when it is required. So I'll end there, inshallah, and I ask us, for those of us who are familiar with these texts, with these teachings, this is the month for us to revive what exactly it is that they're saying to us. Just like this was the spring of the Quran, and the Quran is calling us over and over and over again to action. We are seeing, we are observing. Now there's something that needs to be done. Nahj al-Balagha, the teachings of Imam Ali alayhi salatu wasalam, that just days ago we commemorated his martyrdom, is doing the same thing. And it's for us to also fear the pain and the frustrations that the Imam is communicating through these letters and through these sermons. And what the Imam of our time is also feeling too, and what the Imam of our time is calling us to do. Let's make sure our priorities are in order, brothers and sisters. Let's leave the month of Ramadan with that lesson. So once the day of Eid comes, is a return to those priorities, and we can hope that we never have to experience a month of Ramadan where we see these injustices being perpetrated against not only Muslims, but all those who are voiceless and who are helpless in the world. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Allahumma ameen.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Jazakallah. Thank you so much for that, Sheikh. Uniting against injustice and oppression and standing firmly against oppression is more pressing today than ever before. Now we are heading towards the close. We haven't received any questions from the participants. So in the end, I'd just like to thank everybody who's tuned in to watch and listen to the Stand for Justice CMV's Justice Day 2021 program. We really hope that the talks given today have left everyone with a better understanding and some form of motivation on how to move forward and support the cause of justice and human dignity in our various capacities. Awareness is always the first step, but there is so much more to do. Please do support the good and important work being done by Stand for Justice at DMV. I'd like to thank all our guest speakers and scholars for sharing their insight and all the amazing work that they've done. A big thank you to the organizers for today's program, for putting together everything, getting us all together to further the cause of justice. And thank you all to the participants once again. Jazakallah khair. And thank you. And wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله وعلى الأرواح التي هلت بفنائك عليك مني سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين السلام على الحسين